The coffee was bad. Not bad the way diner coffee is bad, where it's been sitting too long and tastes like someone boiled a leather shoe in it. This was bad in a more personal way. Bad like it knew Kale Morrow had made it himself at 1 a.m. using a machine that hadn't been cleaned since the previous summer, and it was judging him for every choice that had led to this moment. He drank it anyway. The station hummed around him. Not a dramatic hum. Not the kind of hum that signals something important is about to happen. It was the hum of aging equipment doing its job without enthusiasm. The particular sound of machines that had long ago given up hoping anyone interesting would come along. Kale had been at the listening post for 3 years. He was the only person awake in it right now, which was fine because the thing about deep space signals monitoring at 2:47 in the morning is that nothing ever happens. That was the whole job. Listen for nothing. Confirm the nothing. Write a small report about the nothing. Drink coffee while the nothing continues. He had a calibration error on antenna array 7 that nobody had asked him to fix. He was fixing it anyway, because the alternative was staring at a blank readout, and the blank readout always made him think about his ex-wife, who had described living with him as like being married to a parked car, which he'd found unfair at the time, and had since privately decided was pretty accurate. So antenna 7. He was elbow-deep in a diagnostic panel, flashlight in his teeth, when the main board behind him made a sound it had never made before. Not an alarm, not a warning tone. Something between those, a sharp, sustained note that didn't match any of the 12 alert profiles he'd memorized. He stayed in the panel for 3 seconds. The note continued. He pulled out, crossed the room, looked at the screen. A signal had locked. Clean, structured, coming from a bearing of 314.7 degrees declination at roughly 23 light-years out, which was the kind of distance that should have meant radio noise, cosmic background scatter, the usual beautiful garbage of deep space. What it should not have meant was a coherent, repeating signal arriving on a frequency that nothing natural used. Nothing natural used this frequency because the math that governed this frequency was, at its core, too intentional. Kale had learned this in his first 6 weeks here, delivered in a 2-hour lecture by Dr. Fen Ockaffer, who had described it like this. Nature doesn't write in prime sequences, Kale. When you see this frequency light up, that means someone sat down and decided to use it. And that someone is not from here. The frequency was lighting up. Kale ran the interference check, clean. He ran the source triangulation. Consistent, stable, not a pulsar. Pulsars drift in microsecond variance patterns you could measure with a decent watch. This didn't drift. He ran the spectral analysis. The signal had internal structure, layered, like something had been packed inside it, nested, the way you'd nest a message inside an envelope inside a box if you wanted to make absolutely sure the right person knew it was a message and not a rock. He sat down. He picked up his coffee. He drank it. The signal kept coming. He ran every check a second time, not because he thought the first results were wrong, because he needed something to do with his hands while his brain finished the sentence it had started and was very reluctant to complete. Every check came back the same. He pulled up the Decryption Assist, a program so rarely used that it took 45 seconds to load, and when it did, it greeted him with a software update reminder from 8 months ago. He clicked Remind Me Later, because some reflexes are just survival. The program chewed on the signal for 11 minutes. Kale watched the progress bar. He did not get up for more coffee. He did not check his phone. He sat in the specific stillness of a person who has understood something and is waiting for the universe to confirm it. The Decryption Assist resolved. Not into English. It never started with English. It started with math, the universal layer, the thing every intelligent species used because math doesn't have an accent. Prime sequences first, then ratio patterns, then geometrics, Then the signal started doing something that all the math had been building toward. It started to mean something. The meaning assembled itself in layers, the way a photograph develops in a darkroom, dark to pale to real, and Cale watched it come clear on his screen. He read it once. He read it again. He put his coffee cup down on the edge of the console, and it was slightly too far and it tipped, and he grabbed it and set it down properly. And then he sat very still, and then he read it a third time. It was short. Whoever had sent it had understood that length was not the point. The point was to get in, say the thing, and get out before anyone on their end noticed the signal had been sent. It said, "You have been noticed. Your world has been assessed and marked. There is a list, you are at the top of it now. A fleet will come. It will leave your star system empty. I am not permitted to tell you this. I am telling you this. You have 30 days from the arrival of this signal. I do not know what you can do with 30 days. I do not think you can do anything. Run if there is somewhere to run. I am sorry. Do not reply to this frequency. It is monitored. I will not send another message." Below that, a coordinate string, not a name. The signal cut off at 3:02 a.m. Cale sat in the silence of the station. Outside the single reinforced window to his left, the New Mexico desert was doing its usual thing, existing without permission, enormous and flat and indifferent, the kind of landscape that doesn't care whether you have a crisis or not. The stars above it were the same stars they'd always been. The Milky Way cut across the sky in its slow, permanent streak. Same stars. Different meaning. He reached for his coffee. It had gone cold while he'd been reading. He drank it cold. There was a thing that happened in the army, he'd seen it, had been part of it, when a patrol got hit and the first 3 seconds were just bodies doing what training told them to do while the brain caught up. The hands moved before the understanding arrived. He'd always thought that was a design flaw. He'd been corrected by a sergeant who said, "No, Morrow, that's the feature. The brain is the slowest thing in a firefight. Let the hands work." His hands were already at the keyboard. He opened his internal message system. Not the emergency protocol. The emergency protocol went to 12 people simultaneously and triggered a cascade of calls and alerts that would pull people out of bed and start a process that, once started, couldn't be undone. He wasn't ready for that. He didn't know yet what he was ready for. He opened a regular message, the kind you'd send about a broken coffee machine or a software licensing problem. He typed a name into the recipient field, Dr. Fenn Acaffer, head of signal analysis. The only person at this station who had ever looked at a readout and gone quiet in a way that suggested the quiet was respect rather than boredom. He typed, "Fenn, I need you to come in early, like now early. Like I know it's 3 a.m. and I know you hate me and I know this is how every disaster movie starts, but I need you to come look at something before I do anything about it. Don't forward this to anyone. Don't call anyone. Come in and look at what I'm about to attach and then we'll figure out the next part together. K." He attached the full signal data, the raw feed, the decryption assist output, all 12 check results, everything. He moved his mouse to the send button. He sat there for a while. Outside, the desert, the stars, a distant highway, so far away the headlights of passing cars were just slow horizontal sparks, people going somewhere at 3 a.m. for their own private reasons, lives full of problems that were the right size for human beings to have. He thought about the word fleet. He thought about the coordinate string at the bottom of the message, which, when he'd run it through the astronomy assist, had resolved to a point 23 light-years out and slightly above the galactic plane, a region of space that contained no cataloged stellar objects, just space, the kind of space that something could wait in if it didn't want to be seen while it waited. He thought about 30 days. He clicked send. Then he got up, went to the coffee machine and made another pot. While it brewed, he went back to antenna 7. The calibration error was still there. He worked on it with steady hands, checking connections, running the diagnostic sequence, the familiar rhythm of a small, fixable problem, and when the coffee finished, he poured a cup and drank it standing up. Looking at the main board. The signal was gone, silence on every frequency, the universe back to its usual magnificent indifference. But the decryption assist was still open on the screen, the message still there, the words still the same as they'd been the first 3 times he'd read them. "You have been noticed." He looked at the message for a long time. Then he looked at the coordinate string again, the one at the bottom, the thing that wasn't a name. He ran it through the astronomy assist a second time, slower this time, making it work through every possible interpretation. The assist chewed through galactic cartography for 90 seconds and then returned the same result as before: empty space. No cataloged objects, nothing there that science had put on a map. He switched windows, opened the radio telescope's historical log, every archived reading from that bearing over the past 6 months, scrolled back, read. 43 days ago, a faint, anomalous reading on a different frequency. Brief, dismissed at the time as interference. The notation in the log read, probable natural source, no follow-up required, signed by him. He stared at his own handwriting on the screen. 31 days ago, another brief anomalous signal, different frequency again, same bearing, same dismissal. This one wasn't even logged properly, just a footnote on the nightly report that nobody would have looked at. The signal tonight was the third. Whoever had sent it had been checking for 12 weeks. Small signals first. Pings, practically. Knocking on the door with one knuckle before finally putting their shoulder into it. They'd been careful, deliberate, patient in the way that things are patient when they have time. He thought about what it meant that whoever sent the message had bothered to be careful, had not wanted to be detected, had gone to significant effort to reach Earth in a way that would land cleanly, decode correctly, arrive with enough translation architecture that a human being in a room at 3 a.m. could read it without a linguistics team. They'd thought about the person on the receiving end. That small fact sat in his chest in a way he didn't have a word for. His phone buzzed. Fen Akafer, a text message that read, "On my way. Please tell me this is a glitch, please." Kale typed back, "I ran it 12 times. Fen responded, "Oh God." Kale set his phone face down on the console, looked at the window. The desert was starting to go from black to that deep pre-dawn purple that meant the world was working on morning regardless of what anyone wanted. He thought about the message again, the last line, "I do not think you can do anything." He thought about what kind of person sent a message they believed was useless, someone who couldn't live with the alternative, someone who'd made a calculation that said, even if there's a 1 in a million chance this helps, the math of not sending it is worse than the math of sending it. He knew that math. He'd known people who operated on that math, medics mostly. He reached for his coffee. The cup was empty. He got up to get more, and while it was filling, standing in the small kitchen alcove with the machine gurgling beside him and the pre-dawn desert going purple outside, he started, quietly and without drama, making a list in his head. Not of things to be afraid of. A list of what they knew, what the message had given them, not just the warning but the data inside the warning, the structure of the thing, the frequency used, the translation framework embedded in the signal itself, the coordinate string, the timing, 30 days. Every piece of information was a handle. He'd spent 9 years in the Army learning that the difference between a problem and a disaster was usually just how fast you got a handle on it. He poured his coffee, went back to his chair. The message was still on the screen. "You have 30 days. He read it one more time, drank his coffee, warm this time. Then he opened a fresh document, not a report, not an alert, just a blank page, and he wrote 3 words at the top. "What do we know?" Outside, the desert turned pink. The stars faded one by one, not gone, just outcompeted, waiting patiently for the dark to come back around. The highway sparks moved in their slow arcs. The world did its ordinary morning thing. And in a small room full of humming machines at the edge of an empty desert, a man who had once been a soldier began, with the quiet competence of someone who has learned not to waste time being scared, to work the problem. The black car smelled like new leather and someone's very bad afternoon. Director Ashan Nair had been in the middle of a budget hearing. Not the interesting kind. The kind where four people argue about whether $17 million is better spent on deep space antenna maintenance or deep space antenna maintenance, but with a different vendor. When the aide had come in, bent down, and said 4 words in her ear. 4 words. She closed her folder, capped her pen, said "excuse me" to the room and walked out. That had been 11 minutes ago. Now she was in the car, the file open on her lap, the city sliding past the tinted window in its usual oblivious way, people walking and eating and arguing, and doing the 1,000 ordinary human things that people do when the world is still the size they think it is. She read the message. She read it again. She looked out the window. A woman on the sidewalk was arguing with a parking meter, really going at it, pointing, gesturing, doing the full theatrical breakdown at a machine that could not care less. The car slid past before Nair could see how it ended. She looked back at the file. The aide was watching her from the front seat, pretending not to. "How many people have seen this?" she said. "Right now, 4. The analyst who found it, the signal head, the duty officer who ran the verification, and you." "Keep it at 4. "Yes, ma'am." 5 if you count the person who sent it. The aide didn't have an answer for that. Nair hadn't expected one. She looked back at the file. "You have 30 days. She was quiet for 4 minutes. She'd counted them later when she was trying to reconstruct the sequence of her thinking, and it had come to 4. The aide confirmed it. 4 minutes of looking at a single page while the city went about its business outside. Then she said, "Get me Akaffer and the analyst. Get me Generals Park and Osai. Get me the science leads Davy, Marchetti, the Korean astrophysics team that's been working the contact protocol. Get me HFY from systems architecture and the 2 cryptographers, the ones that aren't cleared yet, clear them. Get me a room that isn't on any official floor plan. Get me coffee that isn't from a government machine." She paused. "And get me the attachment." The aide looked up. "The ma'am." The message came with an attachment. She held up the file. "This is the message. Where is the attachment?" The aide started typing. Nair watched him type. She looked back at the window. The parking meter woman was gone. The sidewalk had swallowed her like she'd never existed. The attachment arrived on her tablet 4 minutes later. It was long, bureaucratic in structure, dense with data in a format that the translation assist had partially processed, rendering some columns in clean English and others in a scrambled hybrid that looked like someone had dropped a spreadsheet into a blender with a dictionary. She read the legible parts. Then she read them again, slower. The attachment was a record, not a warning that had been the message. This was something else, something that had been included the way you include a stapled report with a memo, procedurally, because the system required it. An accidental enclosure, the kind of thing someone sends without thinking because in their office it's just standard documentation. In their office, 14 entries, 14 rows in a table with columns for system designation, population estimate at time of marking, days between marking and fleet arrival, response classification, outcome. The outcome column had 1 word in every single row. The same word. She didn't need the translation assist for that column. The word was short, and the meaning was the kind that doesn't require a dictionary in any language. She closed the tablet. The room they found was 3 floors below a federal building that officially contained only storage. It was the kind of room that exists in government structures, the way lint exists in pockets, present, unremarkable, forgotten. Fluorescent lights. A table that wobbled on one leg. 14 people who had all been pulled from somewhere else in the last 90 minutes, and all had the specific wide-awake look of people whose adrenaline had made the decision for them about whether they'd be sleeping tonight. Cale Morrow was at the far end of the table, still in the civilian clothes he'd been wearing at the station. He had a cup of coffee and the look of a man who had made his peace with something several hours ago and was now just waiting for everyone else to catch up. Nair stood at the front of the room. She put the message on the table. She put the attachment next to it. "Read both," she said, "then we talk." 11 minutes of silence. The kind of silence a room gets when 14 people are reading the same thing and arriving, one by one, at the same place. Dr. Fenn Ockhaffer got there first. He set his copy down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady, and he looked at the table surface and he did not say anything. General Park got there second. She set her copy down the opposite way, flat and fast, like a verdict. The others arrived in clusters. The silence changed texture with each one, started as reading quiet, became something heavier. When the last person looked up, Nair said, 14 civilizations, 14 entries. Every one of them received a similar warning or had enough time to see the fleet coming on their own instrumentation. Every one of them." She paused. "The response column uses 4 classifications: fragmentation, flight, capitulation, collapse. 14 entries, 4 classifications. Between them, they cover every possible version of the same thing." She let that sit. "Nobody fought." This from Marchetti, the astrophysicist, who asked it the way you ask a question when you already suspect the answer and are hopping to be wrong. "Nobody organized fast enough to fight," Ockhaffer said. He was reading the attachment again. "Look at the timeline column. Average time between marking and fleet arrival across all 14 is 22 days. We have 30. 8 extra days," someone said. "They gave us extra time," Cale said. Every head turned toward him. He was still looking at his coffee. "The sender, they didn't have to give us the full count. They could have sent the warning 3 days before the fleet got here and it would have been honest. 30 days is more than the average. That's not an accident." He looked up. "They wanted us to have a real shot at something. They just didn't know what." Nair looked at him for a moment. "What's your read on the sender?" she said. He thought about it, not performing the thinking, actually doing it. "Someone who works in bureaucracy," he said. "The message structure is clean, formatted. They know how to pack information efficiently. The attachment came along because that's how their filing system works, message with supporting documentation. They probably didn't even think about it. Just hit send the way you'd file a report." He paused. "They're not a soldier. Soldiers don't apologize in operational communications, but they've got a conscience that got louder than their job." Nair nodded once, filed it. "The coordinate string at the bottom," said the younger of the 2 cryptographers. She had introduced herself as Tors and had been visibly trying to hold herself together since she'd read the attachment. "It's not a name. It's a location identifier. We've been running it. It resolves to empty space, 23 light-years out, no cataloged objects." "Not empty," Cale said. "That's where they're waiting." 200 ships, Park said. "That we know of," Osei added. "That they told us about," Nair said. "The message specified 200. We have no verification. We have no visual. We have a number from a source whose reliability we can't confirm and whose motives we can partially guess at but do not fully understand." She looked around the table. "What we do with that number matters. We don't treat it as a ceiling. We don't treat it as a floor. We treat it as a starting point." "Starting point for what?" Tors asked. Nair didn't answer immediately. She picked up the attachment. "Read the outcome column one more time. 14 identical entries." She set it down. "For not being the 15th row," she said. "The message they composed took 6 hours. Not because the words were hard to find. Because every person in the room had a different idea about what words should do. Some wanted them to plead, some wanted them to threaten, some wanted them to explain, some wanted them to delay. Cale had sat through 4 hours of it without speaking. He'd refilled his coffee twice. He'd read the full message and attachment another 3 times, each time making small marks on a notepad in handwriting that Tors, sitting next to him, could not decipher. Around the 5th hour, when the argument had cycled back to the same 3 positions for the second time, he said, "What did we say to the other 14? The room went quiet. "We weren't there for the other 14, Park said. "No," he said, "the sender was, their file was. They know what every other civilization said when they found out. Probably the Concordat, whatever they are, does too. They've heard all 14 versions of the human response to extinction-level threat." He turned the notepad over. "I don't think we should give them a 15th. "What does that mean?" Marchetti asked. "It means we don't explain ourselves, we don't beg, we don't threaten, we don't have enough information to threaten, and empty threats are just noise." He picked up his pen, clicked it. "We ask a question. That's it. A question does something a statement can't. It requires an answer. It opens a door and puts the other person in the position of deciding whether to walk through." He looked at Nair. "Every civilization they've culled gave them a monologue. Nobody made them talk." Nair looked at him for a long moment. "Write it," she said. He wrote it in 4 minutes, passed it to her. She read it, passed it to Park. Park read it, passed it down the table. It came back to Nair. She read it one more time. It said, "We received your warning. We have questions. Are you available to talk?" "This is the message," she said, "that we're sending to an alien species that has destroyed 14 civilizations and is currently 8 days ahead of schedule on doing the same to ours." "Yes," Cale said. "This 9-word message." 11 words. She looked at him. He was not smiling, but there was something in his face that had made peace with the absurdity of the situation, in a way that most of the people in the room had not yet reached. She looked back at the message. She initialed it. Voss was at his desk when it arrived. It was late in his cycle. The Orathi measured time differently than humans did, but the body's need for rest was a constant across most known species, and Voss's body had been quietly requesting rest for the past 2 intervals with increasing urgency. He'd ignored it. He'd been ignoring a great many things lately. He was doing exactly what he'd told himself he wouldn't do, monitoring the signal band he'd used to send the message, watching it, the way you watch a thing you've set in motion that you cannot take back, hoping that watching it will give you some influence over what it does next. It had given him nothing. Until it did. The signal hit his board at 3.7 in the secondary interval. He almost missed it because he was looking at a different readout. He saw it in his peripheral vision, a small amber light that meant incoming on closed frequency, and his whole body did something involuntary that he did not have time to process. He opened it. The message resolved, short, clean. The translation architecture he'd embedded in his own signal bounced back with a working human-to-Orathi conversion, imperfect at the edges but legible where it mattered. He read it. He read it again. His data tablet was in his hand. He was holding it at an angle without noticing. The edge of it tipped past the edge of his desk and it fell, a clean drop, no spin, straight down, and hit the floor of his office and shattered across the smooth stone in a spread of broken components that he looked at without seeing. He was still looking at the words on his screen. "We received your warning. We have questions. Are you available to talk?" Not a plea. Not a threat. Not the sound of something falling apart. A question, direct, calm, the specific calm of something that has looked at its situation and decided that panic is not on the agenda. He sat in his office for a long time, the broken tablet on the floor, the amber light on his board cycling off as the signal closed. Then he picked up the largest piece of the tablet. Reflexively, the way you pick things up when you've broken them, the habit of trying to put things back that are past putting back. And he held it, and he thought about 14 files in a record that he had spent 6 years compiling, 14 civilizations reduced to a row in a spreadsheet, and how none of them, not one, had looked at 30 days and said, "We have questions." He set the broken piece down, went to his window. The Orathi home station curved away below him in its great slow arc, silver and enormous and very, very certain of its own safety. Ships moved in their assigned corridors. Lights blinked in their assigned patterns. Everything in its place. Everything behaving the way things were supposed to behave. Somewhere, 23 light-years from a small wet planet on the far edge of the mid-spiral, 200 warships waited in the specific patience of things that had never been made to wait for a reason. They'd been waiting for the next 18 days to complete. Voss thought about the message. Thought about the coordinates he'd included, the fleet's position. An accidental mercy, because whoever decoded it would know where the fleet was waiting, and that was one less unknown in an ocean of them. Thought about the attachment. He had not meant to send the attachment. He was a bureaucrat. He always sent the attachment. He pressed his head against the cool material of the window. Outside, the station turned. Everything correct. Everything in order. Somewhere, something was asking questions instead of running. He thought, "I don't know what you are." Then, "I don't think they do either." Voss told himself he was not monitoring Earth. He was reviewing signal data, broad spectrum, routine analysis of mid-spiral transmissions, the kind of background work that every analyst at his level was expected to maintain as part of their standard load. Earth happened to be in the mid-spiral. Earth happened to be emitting signals. He was doing his job. He was absolutely monitoring Earth. Day 3. He expected fragmentation. It was always fragmentation first, the internal fault lines that every civilization carried going suddenly structural under the weight of the news. The 14 files were full of it. Planetary broadcasts that went from unified emergency tone to competing factions in under 40 hours. Governments collapsing into their constituent pieces. The specific entropy of a species discovering, all at once, that their biggest problems had just been replaced by one problem that ate all the others. Earth's signals on day 3 were dense and cross-layered, and encrypted at a level that told him the right people had the information. But underneath the encryption, in the civilian bands, in the ordinary traffic of a planet that mostly didn't know yet. Normal. Mostly normal. Not completely. There were stress signatures in the data, patterns that his analysis tools flagged as elevated, concentrated in certain governmental nodes, certain research channels. The people who knew were carrying it, but the planet itself hadn't buckled. He ran the comparison against the 14 files, checked where each civilization had been on day 3. 11 had already fragmented. 2 had gone silent, the silence of things pulling inward, hiding, making themselves small. 1 had sent a transmission toward the fleet. It was a prayer. Voss had read it once years ago when he was still new enough to the job that reading it had cost him something. He didn't read it again. Earth was not praying. Earth was encrypting things and keeping its civilian population largely calm, and doing something with its signals infrastructure that his tools couldn't quite resolve. He told himself this meant nothing. Day 7. The 6 objects launched from Earth's surface before he registered what they were, and by the time his analysis resolved the launch signatures, they were already past the moon, moving outward, fast and clean on a bearing of 314.7 degrees. His bearing. The fleet's bearing. He sat very still for a moment. Then he pulled their trajectory, ran the intercept math, Let the program work through it twice because the first answer came back wrong. Not wrong in the sense that his tools had made an error. Wrong in the sense that he did not want the answer to be what it was. The answer was what it was. The 6 objects were heading directly toward the fleet's position, not toward the edge of Earth's system, not toward any defensive perimeter, toward the fleet, specifically, on a course so precise that it required knowing exactly where the fleet was. They had the coordinates from his message. He had given them the coordinates. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eye sockets and held them there for a moment that was longer than it looked from the outside. Then he pulled back, looked at the objects' profiles. Not weapons. The mass was wrong for weapons, the power signature too passive, the emission profile pointing not at propulsion but at sensors. Dense sensor packages, the kind you built when you wanted to know everything about a thing before you got close to it. 6 of them, launched on slightly different approach vectors so that whatever they reached would be mapped from 6 angles simultaneously. They weren't sending weapons at the fleet. They were sending eyes. He stared at the screen long enough that the display went to its idle cycle and had to be reactivated. He thought, they got the fleet's position from my message, and their first move was to look at it. Then he thought, of course it was. Day 12. The manufacturing data was harder to read because Earth didn't broadcast its manufacturing data the way some civilizations did. There were no open industrial feeds, no production transparency mandates. He had to read it sideways, through energy consumption patterns, through raw material transport signatures, through the particular kind of electromagnetic noise that large-scale fabrication put into the air. He read it sideways, and for 4 days it looked like shelter construction. The energy profiles were consistent with that, the material movements plausible, and he had filed a preliminary note in his private log that said * probable civilian bunker program, consistent with defensive preparation, because that was the logical interpretation, and he was an analyst who followed logic. On day 12, he looked at the distribution pattern. Bunkers concentrated around population centers. That was standard. These weren't concentrated around population centers. They were distributed in a network, nodes connected by what looked, from the transport signatures, like heavy infrastructure, the kind you didn't build unless you intended to move very large things along it very efficiently. Not shelters, not static defensive positions. Something you could move through, something that connected things that needed to be connected. He pulled the energy consumption data and ran it against the known profiles in his database: shielding, power generation, launch infrastructure. He leaned back in his chair. The chair made the small sound it always made when he leaned back, a sound he'd been meaning to have fixed for 3 intervals and never had, and he sat in that familiar small sound while his brain caught up to what his tools were telling him. They weren't building shelters. They were building a fleet. Not 200 ships. Nothing close to 200 ships. The time wasn't there for that. The materials weren't there for that. He wasn't sure the physics were there for that. But something. Things that were meant to leave the ground and go somewhere and do something when they got there. He opened his communication console. Closed it. Opened it again. This was the moment where a responsible analyst filed a report, flagged the anomaly, let the process handle it, let the fleet commander know that the target species was engaging in what exactly? Resistance, yes, probably, that was the classification. He sat with the word *resistance for a moment. 14 files. Not one of them contained that word in any active sense. Resistance, as recorded in the archive, meant the desperate last movements of things already breaking, barricades built from the rubble of collapsed governments, transmissions sent into empty space, gestures made by dying things that had run out of other gestures to make. This was day 12. Earth's government had not collapsed. Earth was building things. He did not file the report. He told himself he would do it tomorrow. Day 15. He sent the message at the start of his shift, before he could think about it long enough to stop himself. You should be evacuating. That was all. Clean. Simple. The last thing a responsible official should say to the species he'd illegally warned, sent on a frequency that was monitored during working hours from his registered console. He sent it. Waited. The reply came in 40 minutes. To where? 2 words. He read them 6 times. The thing about asterisk to where is that it sounded like despair, like the question of something that had already given up and was just pointing at the walls of its situation. But it wasn't. He knew it wasn't because he'd read all 14 files, and he knew what despair looked like in a transmission, and this wasn't it. This was a different thing wearing the same shape. This was a point of logic. To where meant, we have assessed our options and found them insufficient. To where asterisk meant, running requires a destination and we have no destination, so we have removed running from the list of available actions, and we are now working with what's left. What was left was 30 days. He sat at his console for a long time after that. He had no answer. He had never had an answer. He had sent the warning without an answer because you didn't need to have the answer in order to know that someone deserved the question. He did not send another message. He kept watching. Day 22. The transmission that hit the fleet's position was clean and structured and addressed, formally, with correct header protocol, as if whoever sent it had researched the Concordat's communication standards and used them deliberately to the commanding officer of the approaching force. Admiral Drenthal received it at the start of his command cycle. He read it 3 times. He had commanded the culling fleet for longer than some civilizations had maintained written language. He had received a great many transmissions from target species. He had filed them all. He remembered only a few, the ones that had contained in their final desperate lines something that briefly resembled dignity. This one was not final, and it was not desperate. It was a request for a ceasefire negotiation, written in Concordat standard protocol, with terms. Terms offered by the species being culled. He stood at his command station and read it again, more slowly. The terms were not unreasonable. That was the thing his brain kept returning to, worrying at, unwilling to put down. They weren't a bluff. They weren't the inflated demands of something that knew it had nothing. They were specific, bounded, written by something that understood the structure of a negotiation because it had done negotiations before, had learned the grammar of compromise and was applying it here to this, to a fleet bearing down on it from 8 days out. They are negotiating, he thought, with a fleet. He almost laughed. He didn't. The thing that moved through him instead was not quite what he'd call amusement. He had a word for it in his language, the particular sensation of encountering something that had no business being what it was. He filed the transmission under standard protocol. Then he went to the viewport and looked at the dark. 8 days. He had done this 14 times. He knew what 8 days felt like from this position, the specific weight of the distance closing, the math of it, the certainty. It was one of the few certainties he carried without question. He stood at the viewport, and for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, the certainty felt like a thing that could be moved. He did not like that feeling. He went back to work. Day 29. The 6 sensor probes reached the fleet at 3:40 in the fleet cycle, while most of the crew was in their rest period, and the skeleton watch was doing what skeleton watches do, being bored in a professional capacity. The first probe arrived without announcement. No signal, no transmission. It simply appeared on the perimeter sensors at exactly the range its trajectory had pointed it toward, and it sat there for 11 seconds, and in those 11 seconds it pulsed, a dense, rapid series of emissions in a dozen bands simultaneously, and the watch officer who flagged it had just enough time to categorize it as non-hostile before it destroyed itself. The second arrived 14 seconds later, same thing. Then the third, fourth, fifth, sixth. 2 minutes and 40 seconds total, then silence. The watch officer filed an alert. The analysis team came off rest. Drenthal was in his command station within 6 minutes of the last probe's detonation, looking at the spectral readout, looking at what the probes had emitted. They'd been mapped. All 200 ships. Complete structural mapping, hull composition, power distribution, weapon emplacement geometry, engine configuration, shield harmonics. Everything a military analyst would need to know about 200 warships to understand exactly how they were built and exactly where the seams were. Packed into a 2-minute pulse, sent home. Then the probes had taken themselves apart, so there was nothing to study in return. Drenthal stood at his console and looked at the data and felt the word arrive in his chest the way words sometimes arrived. Not thought, just there, like something that had been waiting for the right moment. Thalvrin. His language had a specific word for it. Most languages didn't bother, because most species encountered things that knew they should be afraid or things that didn't know and were subsequently destroyed. The middle case, the thing that doesn't know it should be afraid and acts, therefore, with a freedom that fear would have taken from it, was rare enough that most languages left it unnamed. His language had named it. He stood at his console and felt it and did not speak. One day. He looked at the dark outside the viewport. 1 day of distance. The math was the same as it had always been. The fleet was the same fleet. The target was the same category of problem it had been when he'd left home. He thought about the sensor probes, about the manufacturing signatures his intelligence team had been reporting for the past 10 days, the distributed network, the launch infrastructure, the things being built and connected and made ready in the specific way of things that intended to be used. He thought about the negotiation request, the terms, the absurdity of the terms. He thought about the question, "Are you available to talk?" He had not answered it. That was not his role. His role was the fleet, the closing distance, the certainty. The certainty that felt now, for the first time, like a wall that something had decided to walk through rather than stop at. He pulled up the communication console, stared at it, closed it, looked at the viewport. One day, he went back to work, because he was a professional and this was his job, and 30 years of certainty did not dissolve in a 29-day sprint. But his hands, when he set them on the console, were doing something they had not done in longer than he could clearly remember. They were not quite steady. The fleet came out of faster-than-light travel the way large things always do, not with drama, not with the movie version of it, but with a kind of absolute physical fact. One moment the space at the edge of Earth's solar system was empty. The next moment it wasn't. 200 ships, each one a city that had learned to move, hanging in the dark like a statement. The statement was, "This is over." Admiral Drenthal stood at the forward viewport of the flagship and looked at the system that was supposed to be number 15. Small yellow star, 8 planets. The third one wet and loud with electromagnetic noise, the kind of noise a species makes when it doesn't know yet how to be quiet. He'd seen it before. He knew what it sounded like from this distance. He gave the order to hold position. Standard pre-operation pause. Let the target see them. Let the seeing do its work. He waited for the panic signals. 14 times he had done this. 14 times the electromagnetic noise from the target planet had changed in character within 6 minutes of the fleet's arrival, the specific frequency shift of a civilization discovering all at once that the dark had stopped being empty, broadcast patterns fragmenting, civilian channels spiking, the audio equivalent of a species learning to scream. He waited. The noise from the third planet did not change. Not fragmentation, not the spike. The signals were still dense, still encrypted, still moving in the controlled patterns of a communications infrastructure being managed rather than overwhelmed. They knew the fleet was here. They had known it was coming. They were not screaming. He stood at the viewport, and the viewport gave him nothing but stars and the distant warmth of a yellow sun, and the quiet of 200 warships that had never, in their operational history, needed to do anything but arrive. The silence from the watch officer behind him was the particular silence of someone who wanted to ask a question and had correctly assessed that now was not the time. Drenthal looked at the dark between his fleet and the third planet. Empty. He expected a debris field, not organized resistance. The analysis reports had been clear that Earth had nothing capable of standing against the fleet in a direct engagement, regardless of what they'd been building in the last 30 days. But debris, the desperate scatter of a species throwing everything it had at the math and hoping the math would blink. Empty. He turned from the viewport. Perimeter scan, he said. Running. 30 seconds. Clean, Admiral, no objects within. The sensor board lit up. Not an alert, not a warning tone, just a single contact resolving on the close-range array bearing 004, which was not the direction of Earth, which was not the direction of anything, which was a patch of space 600 meters off the flagship's port side that had been empty since the fleet arrived. Had been. The contact resolved into a ship. Medium-sized. Not large, not a threat in terms of mass. Human construction, the analysis subroutine confirmed in the same breath, cross-referencing against the manufacturing signatures from the last 30 days, the material compositions his intelligence team had logged, the particular engineering grammar of a species that had learned to build things in a hurry and had built them well anyway. It had been there. Since before the fleet arrived, it had been sitting 600 meters off the flagship's port side, with whatever passed for a human cloaking system wrapped around it, waiting. Not hiding. Waiting. There is a difference, and Drenthal felt it in his chest like a door opening into cold air. The ship hailed them. The inside of the human ship smelled like recycled air, and something Kale had made in the galley that he refused to call coffee, but that had been doing the job of coffee for 16 days. He was standing in the corridor outside the conference room in clothes that had been pressed once, and had given up on the concept since then, the closest thing to formal wear that anyone had been able to source in the time available, which told you something about the time available. Nair was beside him. She was looking at the door. If they fire on us, she said, we won't feel it. That's the optimistic read, Kale said. I know. I was agreeing with you. She looked at him. He looked at the door. They answered the hail, he said. That's the thing, they didn't have to, they could have fired the moment we decloaked. He paused. They answered it. They're curious. Something's curious. Curious is good. Curious means they want information, and wanting information means they think there might be information worth having, which means they think we might know something they don't. Do we? He thought about the 6 probe reports, the structural schematics of 200 warships, the complete hull composition analysis that Dr. HFY had spent 11 days turning from raw data into something an engineer could actually use. Yeah, he said, we do. The conference room door opened. 2 Orathi guards in the specific posture of beings who were professionally calm and personally unsettled came through first, then 2 aides with data pads, then Admiral Drenthal. He was tall, not startlingly tall, human range tall near enough, but the way he occupied space was different. The way very old things occupy space. Like the space had been rearranged to accommodate him a long time ago and hadn't been put back. His face was the face of something that had made a great many decisions and stopped being bothered by most of them. He looked at Kale. He looked at Nair. He looked at the table, human-made, bolted to the floor, 2 chairs on each side, a surface that didn't wobble because Tors had fixed the wobble at 4 a.m. 2 days ago with a piece of hull shielding and considerable profanity. He looked at the 2 cups on the table. "Sit down," Nair said, "please." It wasn't a question. It wasn't aggressive. It was the voice of someone who had run 6 governments' worth of meetings and knew that sitting down was the first decision you had to get everyone to agree on before any other decision was possible. Drenthal sat. His aides did not sit. They stood behind him, which was fine, because Kale was also not sitting yet. He was at the small counter along the wall, doing something that involved a flask and 2 cups, and a level of concentration that was either completely genuine or a very good performance of completely genuine. He brought the cups to the table, set one in front of Nair, set one in front of Drenthal. Sat down. Drenthal looked at the cup. "Coffee," Kale said. "It's a human thing. Hot bitter keeps you awake when you need to be awake. We drink it when we have to think." He picked up his own cup, drank. "You don't have to." Drenthal looked at the cup for another moment. He did not touch it. "You decloaked 600 meters from my flagship," he said. His translated voice was even, flat in the specific way of something that had spent decades making sure it was. "Yes," Nair said. "You were there before we arrived." "Yes. That is not a capability your species should have." "We had 30 days and a very specific problem," Kale said. "You'd be surprised what that combination produces." Drenthal looked at him. The look was not hostile. It was the look of something recalibrating, running a number it had already run and getting a different answer and running it again. "You are aware," he said, "of why we are here." "We are aware of why you think you're here," Nair said. "We'd like to discuss the criteria." "The criteria are not negotiable." "Everything is negotiable. That's not optimism, that's just math." She opened the folder in front of her. "You use 12 criteria to classify a species as a Class 7 threat. We reviewed them." A pause. "Reviewed them," Drenthal said. "You included them in the attachment," Kale said. "The one your analyst sent with the warning. The Concordat's classification framework full version. We're guessing that was an accident." Something moved in Drenthal's face, too fast to name. "We meet 11, Nair said. "We know that. We're not going to argue 11 of 12 with you. We looked at the criteria and they're fair and we meet them." She turned a page in the folder. "The 12th criterion is, the species shows no capacity for cooperative galactic integration." She let that land. "We've been in contact," she said, "with 17 civilizations, not the Concordat, your member civilizations, the ones inside your borders that you've had under Concordat governance for, depending on species, between 200 and 800 years. She slid the document across the table. "The ones you classified as silent." Drenthal looked at the document. He did not touch it. "They weren't silent," Kale said. "They were talking to us. We made contact 11 years ago quietly, carefully, because we didn't know the political situation and we didn't want to cause problems for anyone. We just," he paused, looking for the right word, "talked, traded information, learned things, taught things, the way people do." 17 civilizations, Nair said. "All Concordat members, all in good standing, all party to this treaty." She tapped the document, "which they asked us to draft, because we apparently have a talent for paperwork." The room was quiet. One of the aides behind Drenthal shifted weight from one foot to the other, a tiny movement, the only movement in the room. Drenthal reached out, picked up the document. "Read it, not quickly, the way you read something when you're not reading for information, but reading to verify that you understand what you're looking at, and what you're looking at is what you think it is." He set it down, looked at Nair, looked at Kale, looked at the cup of coffee that was still sitting in front of him, getting cold the way things do when nobody drinks them. He picked up the cup. He drank. His face did nothing obvious, but he held the cup after, the way you hold something that you didn't expect to be what it was. This treaty, he said, if ratified, it would require. We know what it requires, Nair said. We wrote it. A fundamental restructuring of Concordat membership protocols. Yes. The Council of Seven would need to. Yes. This is not, he stopped, reconsidered. The pause was the length of a man putting down something very heavy and deciding to pick up something different. Earth has existed in our records for 400 years. You were assessed twice before this marking. Both times you were classified sub-threshold. We had a few centuries, Kale said. We kept busy. You sent 6 probes to scan my fleet. We sent eyes, not weapons. You built a cloaking system in 30 days. We built a working cloaking system in 30 days, Kale said. The math already existed. We just needed the motivation. Drenthal set the cup down. Looked at it. The cup was plain, white, a human object made for human hand. There was a small chip on the rim, not structural damage, just the edge knocked off somewhere along the way. The kind of wear that said this cup has been used, has been dropped, has been kept anyway. He looked at it for what seemed, in the silence, like a long time. You were not supposed to be here, he said, not to Nair, not quite to Kale, almost to the cup. In our models, species at your development level receiving a culling notification do not. He stopped again. The stopping was not uncertainty. It was the deliberate pause of something that was going to say a true thing and was choosing to say it precisely. They do not put a ship 600 meters off my flagship and offer me coffee. We're not most species, Kale said. No. Are you available to talk? Drenthal looked at him. The question had been the first thing Earth had ever said to the Concordat. It sat in the room, now the way first things sit, small and enormous at the same time. I am here, Drenthal said. That is your answer. Kale nodded. Nair opened the folder to the second page. Outside the viewport, the fleet held its position. 200 ships, patient, waiting for the order that had always come before in 14 systems, circling 14 different suns. The order didn't come. Inside the room, a human poured coffee for something that had ended worlds. They began to talk. The fleet went home. Not all at once, not dramatically. 200 ships turning in the dark and pointing themselves at the place they'd come from, one by one, like a sentence being unwritten. The last one cleared the edge of the solar system at 6:11 on a Tuesday morning, and the watch officer at the New Mexico station who logged it. A young woman 3 weeks into the job who had been told nothing and had figured out something, wrote in the incident report. Anomalous contact, resolved, no further action required, and then sat for a while looking at the word resolved like it owed her an explanation. It didn't go home because it was defeated. Drenthal's report to the Council of Seven made that clear in the specific language of someone who had spent decades making sure words meant exactly what he wanted them to mean and nothing else. The fleet was not defeated. The fleet had encountered a situation that fell outside its operational parameters and had made the professional assessment that proceeding without Council guidance would be, his word, premature. The Council of Seven read the report. Then they read the treaty. Then they called Voss. He arrived at the council chamber the way a man arrives at something he has been dreading since the moment he made the decision that made it inevitable. Straight-backed, hands still, the particular composure of someone who has used up their fear in advance and is now running on something quieter. The chamber was large. It was always large. The Concordat had built its meeting rooms the way all old powers build their meeting rooms, to remind everyone who entered that the room had existed before them and would exist after, that the institution was the real presence in the space, and the individuals were just temporary arrangements of matter passing through it. Voss had worked in this building for 11 years. He sat down. Counselor Methra spoke first. She was the oldest of the 7, which meant she had watched more things in than anyone else in the room, and she had the eyes of someone for whom that fact had become, over time, less like grief and more like weather. "You sent an unauthorized communication," she said. "Not an accusation, a starting point." "Yes," Voss said. "To a Class 7 target species." "Yes." "During an active culling operation." "Yes." She looked at him the way very old things look at things that have surprised them. Not warmly, not coldly, just with the specific attention of something recalibrating against a data point it did not expect. "Why?" she said. He had prepared an answer. He had built it carefully over the weeks since the message, adding to it when new things happened, shaping it into something that sounded like logic, like policy critique, like the considered position of a professional who had identified a systemic failure and acted on principle. He did not give that answer. "I read all 14 files," he said. "Every record, every response, every outcome." He looked at the table. "I have been maintaining that archive for 6 years. I added entries and cross-referenced data and updated classifications, and I never," he stopped. "I never read them all in sequence before. I always read them one at a time as records. When I read them as a story, they were." He stopped again. Methra waited. "They were awful," he said. "Not strategically. Personally. They were personally awful in a way I was not prepared for, and I could not stop thinking about the 15th entry, and I could not make the thinking stop, and eventually I sent the message because it was the only thing that made the thinking quiet." The chamber was still. The other 6 counselors had the various expressions of beings who had expected a defense and received a confession, and were not sure yet what to do with the difference. Methra folded her hands on the table. "And what did you think they would do?" she said. "The humans, what did you think they would do with 30 days? He thought about the probes, the manufacturing signatures, the cloaking system that should not exist, the treaty with 17 civilizations that the Concordat had spent centuries believing were silent, the single ship, 600 meters from the flagship, that had been waiting in the dark before the fleet arrived, patient as something that has decided panic is not on the agenda. He thought about the question Earth had sent back. "Are you available to talk?" He thought about a parking lot full of broken tablet parts and how he'd picked one up by reflex, the way you pick things up when you've broken them, the habit of trying to put back things that are past putting back. "I thought they would panic," he said. And instead, the answer was simple. He had watched it build for 30 days from a distance of 23 light years, and he still did not entirely have words for it in any language he spoke, but he had one word that was close enough. "They built something," he said. The vote was not unanimous. It never was on anything that mattered. That was not cynicism. That was just the Concordat, 7 species trying to agree on a single future, the disagreements as structural as the agreement, the friction the thing that kept the machine honest. 4-3. The provisional ceasefire was ratified. The culling order suspended. Earth removed from the active list and reclassified, not as safe, not as welcome, but as asterisk pending, which in Concordat terminology meant the situation has changed and we are determining what changed means. It was not peace. Peace took longer. Peace took the treaty going to subcommittee, and the subcommittee taking 8 months to agree on a framework, and the framework going back to Earth for revision and Earth's revision, coming back, annotated by all 17 allied civilizations, with suggestions that ranged from the practical to the optimistic, to one that Kale later described as written by someone who has never met a government. But the fleet went home. That was the thing that happened first, and it was the thing that mattered most, because all the other things could only happen if that happened first. Drenthal's private report was 40 pages long. He filed it 3 days after returning to Concordat space, sitting at the desk in his quarters on a ship that had turned around for the first time in its operational history without completing its assigned task, and he wrote it the way he did everything. Carefully, without drama, with the specific commitment to accuracy that had made him good at a job that required you to be very sure about the things you were sure about. The report was a military assessment, engagement probability, risk calculus, resource projection. The numbers that answered the question, what would a war with Earth have cost? The answer was, more than the Concordat was willing to spend. Not because Earth's military capacity was equal to the fleet's. It wasn't. The honest math said the fleet would have won a direct engagement, probably, in the first exchange. But Earth had 17 allied civilizations, with inside knowledge of Concordat military infrastructure. Earth had complete structural schematics of 200 warships. Earth had 30 days of applied problem-solving aimed at exactly one problem, which had already produced a functional cloaking system that should not exist. And the math said that given another 30 days, another 60, another year, the number of things Earth produced that should not exist would scale in a direction that made the word asterisk probably asterisk load-bearing, in ways the Concordat preferred to avoid. And Earth. His report noted in its final section, in the specific dry language of a military officer, stating an observation he cannot quantify but cannot omit. Earth did not appear to recognize when it should stop. Every other civilization in the culling record had a ceiling, a point where the weight of the situation made them fold inward, accept the math, give up the ground. Every one of the 14 had hit that ceiling within the first 8 days. Earth had been given 30. He did not think they had hit the ceiling. He did not think they had found it yet. He wrote that in the report, underlined it, not as a threat, as a data point, the most important data point in 40 pages of data points. Earth does not appear to become cheaper the longer you wait. He filed it, poured something from the cabinet in his quarters that was the Arathi equivalent of a drink at the end of something long, sat with it. He thought about the coffee. Bitter, hot, the specific function of a thing designed to keep you awake when you need to be awake. He had not expected to like it. He had liked it in the way you like something that is honest about what it is. He thought about the chip on the rim of the cup. Used, dropped, kept anyway. He drank his drink and looked at the dark outside his viewport, which was ordinary dark now, travel dark, the dark between places rather than the dark before something. He thought, I have destroyed 14 civilizations. Then I did not destroy the 15th. He sat with both thoughts, did not try to make them into one. Cale went back to the station. He drove out the morning after the debrief, which had lasted 4 days, and had involved enough institutional coffee to corrode something structural. And when he pulled into the gravel lot, and the familiar hum of the building reached him through the car door, he sat for a moment with his hand on the handle. Same hum. Same desert. Same flat, enormous sky doing its slow performance of infinity in every direction. He got out, went inside, made coffee. It was bad. It was always bad. He drank it at the main console while the board ran its startup cycle and the readouts came online one by one, the universe checking in with its usual contents. He opened a new communication file. Address the frequency, the closed one, the one that was monitored. He typed, thanks for the fax. 3 words sent. He leaned back. The chair made no particular sound. He looked at the ceiling for a while. The reply came in 47 minutes. He read it, looked at it for a moment. Then he laughed alone in the station, real laughter, the kind that comes up from somewhere lower than your chest, the kind that has relief in it. It said, "You are welcome. Please never contact me again. I am very tired." He read it 3 more times. He did not reply. Voss was not punished. He was restructured, which in Concordat bureaucracy was a different thing. His role was changed, his clearance adjusted, his file annotated with the specific terminology that meant this person operates outside predictable parameters, and that carried, depending on who was reading it, either the weight of a warning or the weight of a recommendation. His new assignment was the Office of Pending Classifications. It had not existed before him. Methra had created it in the week after the vote. Its mandate was this: for any civilization on the approach to Class 7, someone would read the full file before the marking. Not a summary. The full file. The record of every civilization that had been in the same position before. As a story, not as a record. Voss was the office. He was, for the foreseeable future, the office. He sat in it on his first day, and looked at the stack of files in front of him, and the new desk, and the new chair that did not make any sound yet, and would not until he had used it long enough to wear it into the shape of him. He thought about Earth. He thought about what it had done with 30 days. He thought about the question that had come back across 23 light-years on a monitored frequency, in the middle of the night, when he was already afraid. "Are you available to talk?" He was. He opened the first file. The desert was the same. The stars above it were not. Somewhere out there, 200 ships were going home. Somewhere, in the political machinery of a civilization that had existed for 800 years and had never once been made to stop and reconsider, something was turning on a hinge that had not moved in a very long time. And somewhere, at a desk, in an office that had not existed a month ago, a bureaucrat who had sent a message he was not supposed to send was reading the story of a civilization and trying to feel the weight of it before he filed a number. And somewhere in a room full of humming machines at the edge of an empty desert, a man who had once been a soldier was looking at the stars through a small window, coffee going cold beside him, thinking about the question that had started all of it. Not the fleet, not the treaty, not the 30 days. The question: are you available to talk? They always were. That was the thing nobody in the Concordat's 800-year history had thought to write down, not as strategy, not as policy, just as a fact about human beings, the way you'd write down that they needed oxygen or averaged a certain temperature or built things when they were scared. They talked, even when talking seemed like the wrong-sized tool for the problem. Even when the problem was 200 warships and a deadline and a galaxy that had already decided what they were. They talked, and they asked questions, and they made coffee for things that had ended worlds, and they waited in the dark 600 meters from the thing that was supposed to kill them, patient and strange and stubborn in a way that no one in the records had thought to account for. The stars looked the same. They were not the same. Cale drank his cold coffee. Outside, the desert held the dark the way it always did, without effort, without drama, just the enormous ordinary fact of existing in the middle of something much larger than itself, and not particularly minding. He thought that was probably the right approach. He turned back to his console. There was work to do. There was always work to do. That, too, was the right approach.